This is such a common roadblock when you're just getting started with jazz. You're practicing scales and arpeggios, but getting that to sound right in a solo is very difficult, and the only help that you can find is adding more complicated and weird things, which doesn't really solve the problem and just gives you more scales and arpeggios to practice. Most of the time, the problem is that your solos sound too much like they're just running up and down scales, which is maybe correct, but also pretty boring and predictable. As you can hear, everything is moving stepwise and nothing is really happening. And to fix this, you need to get better at using scales and arpeggios more creatively. I'm gonna show you some simple strategies for that in this video without throwing scales, chromatic passing chords and superimposed pentatonics at you. The first thing to add is arpeggios, since the previous example didn't have any arpeggios and they really help break up lines that are only scale movement. But you want to use them in the right way. A rule that I see quite often online for jazz is arpeggio up, scale down. And that's actually very similar to a counterpoint rule for melodic tension, which says that a leap in one direction is resolved by motion in the opposite direction. That counterpoint rule is a good one for a stable melody, but later I'm going to show you some examples where great jazz lines break some of the counterpoint rules as well. Arpeggio up, scale down is pretty easy to play. Just watch out that it isn't the only thing that you do with arpeggios. Here I'm using it from D-7 to G7. But you can also change things up by inserting a descending arpeggio and treat that as a break from a scale run. You play the arpeggio and then go back up to the note below the note that you started on. Here I'm using that over the D-7 chord, and I'm using another really useful trick, the arpeggio from the third. In this case, that's an F major 7 arpeggio. And just to quickly explain that, if you look at the notes of D-7 and F major 7 together, you can see that 3 of the notes are the same. And the only difference is the E, which is a ninth against the D-7, and that also sounds great. You can do this with most chords, and it just means that you have several arpeggios available for any chord that you're soloing over. You may have noticed that I sometimes have some other ways of not playing scale runs in the last two examples, and I'll get to those in a bit as well. Another way to use an arpeggio is to play it as a triplet, which is a really great way to change up the flow with rhythm. In this example, you also want to notice how I'm using the descending arpeggio melody that I just showed you, but now it's from the arpeggio from the third of G7, B half diminished. Before we get to the very simple melodic technique that breaks the counterpoint rules, then I want to show you what I used at the beginning of the second example to create this. One of the most important parts of the sound of good bop-inspired jazz lines is that they have sort of surprising twists and turns, but they also have direction and forward motion. And that's what I'm using here, enclosures, which is an incredibly deep topic and something that helps you create great lines on scale melodies, arpeggios, and triads. On the D-7 line, I start on the A, and then instead of moving directly down to the F, which would be the next note in the arpeggio, then there are two notes placed around the F, the E under it, and then the G above it. So that's the enclosing part, and that resolves to that F, so. And what makes it even more powerful is that the enclosure moves up from E to G, which is the opposite direction of the melody, which is moving down from A to F. So it has both forward motion and also a surprising change of direction. The easiest way to work on this is to use two-note chromatic enclosures on the arpeggio, because they're the most flexible and also the easiest to play. The concept is really simple: a diatonic note above and a chromatic note below. So for D-7, then we have an E above and then a C sharp below, resolving to the D. And then for the next note, we have a G above, an E below, and then resolving to F. And that gives you this exercise. And you can play it descending as well. And just using this concept on the arpeggio gives you solid lines that are anything but boring. Here I'm using the enclosure around F and D on the D-7 and also around the B on the G7. Let's have a look at how bebop breaks some counterpoint rules and then start talking about how you actually get all of this into your playing, because that's maybe not that obvious. In many ways, then bebop and jazz lines are closely related to the language of Bach, and the rule that I mentioned about resolving a leap in one direction by moving in the opposite direction does sound really natural and actually fits a lot of jazz lines. Think of the Ellington ending. But here the interval of a minor 6 is not allowed in counterpoint, so it is in that way breaking the rules, and the descending minor 6 is actually a great sound for jazz lines. Jazz also doesn't have a problem with parallel fifths and a few other things, but of course counterpoint was also created for polyphonic vocal music, so that isn't that surprising. The descending 6 interval can be used as an incredible sound. A simple version of it is to insert it between the half steps in the scale. So in C major, that will be between the C and the B, where you place an E, and between the F and the E, where it's an A. And these interval skips are great for bebop and used all over the place. There are more options, but for this I'm going to stick with these two. Check out how I first use the interval skip and then 2 enclosures on the D minor 7 chord, and then I'm following that up with the descending arpeggio technique on the G7. By now you should be wondering how you internalize material like this. You probably noticed that I'm not really giving you specific licks. It's more like recipes for melodies that you can move around and use to create your own licks. You could look at getting this into your playing as a 3-step process, where I think the second step is the one that's left out very often, and also the reason why you don't really get it into your playing. The first step is exercises, because first you need to take care of any exercises like practicing the scales or being able to play the arpeggios or the enclosures. The next step is to start internalizing that material, so start composing lines with the topic that you're working on. Take a single thing and start making lines. You want to be able to play these lines that you come up with in time, but the biggest focus should be on making a lot of lines. That's where you learn something and where you start to hear the melodies that you want to get into your playing. Keep it simple and don't try to do only new things, because you actually also want to connect the new things that you're working on with what you're already playing, so that it becomes a flexible and active part of your vocabulary, not something that you have to think about. The third step is the final part of internalizing the material. So take a song that you know very well and then start soloing while you focus on using the new melodic technique or piece of vocabulary that you want to get into your playing. In the beginning you have to think about it, but later it's going to come much more natural and become just a part of the flow and a part of your vocabulary. Most of the time, students underestimate the benefit of writing tons of licks and really exploring the material in that way. Keep in mind that Barry Harris taught bebop by writing licks and explaining the lines in his master classes. Composing licks can also be great for developing your rhythm and your phrasing. So let's look at that. Keeping up with the changes is very difficult in the beginning, and often we try to hit target notes on beat 1 whenever the chords change, just to make it clear to ourselves that we're really following the harmony. This is an important skill, but it's not really great for your rhythm. So here are 2 things you should try to work on that really helps lighten it up. Don't stop on beat 1. When you end the line, in this case, I guess that makes the most sense on the C major 7 in the 2-5-1, then continue into the bar and try to end on an offbeat, like I will do in the next example, and see if you can spot all the other stuff from this video that I'm using. And this example actually already used the next thing that I want to talk about when it moved from D minor 7 to G7. Resolve on the forehand. Try to resolve to the chord on the forehand to anticipate the chord change. Again, just adding some forward motion and energy to your solo. And in the example, notice how the enclosure is used to help that transition from D minor 7 to G7. The phrasing is really where the music is, and when it comes to phrasing in jazz, then I think one of the most important parts is the dynamics in the line, and you can use technique to make that easier. This is probably also why so many jazz guitarists will mix a lot of different techniques when they play. It is the most efficient way to get the right phrasing. For the dynamics, then 2 techniques are really great to incorporate: slides and legato. Here's an example without any phrasing. And here it is with some added phrasing techniques, and notice that I tend to use techniques so that I pick a note on the offbeat and make that louder than the note that follows on the downbeat. I'm sure you can hear the difference. When you start working on this, then try to find some simple licks where you have a high note on an offbeat, like this way of playing a D minor 7 arpeggio. Or you can use a pull-off from an offbeat in a descending scale run like this, which actually as a bonus also makes it easier to play for your right hand. One of the most difficult moments I've ever experienced on stage in front of an audience is tied to a myth, something that people sometimes will say, but that actually isn't true. It's easy to waste practice time on stuff like that, and you can better focus on actually learning how to play and building the skills that you need. I tell the story of that failure on stage, was a disaster really, and some of the other concepts that you should not waste your time on in this video. Check it out.